What's the next move for Congress? Different.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Taco Comfort Solutions.
Alrighty, what is the move for Congress now? This is the conversation and the science of politics that I'm most interested in. Joe Cammarano, our expertise from Providence College, our political science professor. He and I have had conversations about the Trump campaign and the Trump presidency the entire way, and I'm interested to see what his take is on the results of the 4-page letter from Attorney General Barr to Congress, not the report, because we haven't seen the report, right? But let's get to it. Great to have you aboard. Thanks very much for checking in. Here's a headline that reflects today's action. Mueller did not find Trump or his campaign conspired. Also did not, okay, it depends. Every headline and every interpretation on this is different, right? Here's the latest from the network on what's been happening in the last 24 hours.
We're glad it's over.
With the special counsel's report in the hands of the Justice Department, President Trump is going on the offensive.
A lot of people out there that have done some very, very evil things, very bad things, I would say treasonous things. Those people will certainly be looked at.
His Republican allies followed suit, confident Robert Mueller's report has vindicated the president.
Mr. Mueller thoroughly investigated the Trump campaign. You cannot say that about the other side of the story.
The Democrats have way overstepped and overplayed this.
Others urged caution.
When you get what you want, leave it alone. Don't be a meathead about this, Mr. President.
In a 4-page summary, Attorney General William Barr said Mueller did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with Russia. But on the question of whether the president obstructed justice, Barr said while Mueller's report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him.
There are a lot of open questions.
Congressman Adam Schiff and 5 other House committee chairmen, each with their own investigations into the president, are asking Barr for the full report by next Tuesday.
We will use the Mueller report and the underlying evidence when we obtain it to make decisions about the focus of our investigation.
Barr says he intends to release as much of the report as he can.
All right. Well, we'll see. You know, as he can, it's going to be interesting because of the grand jury, and then top secret, and then ongoing investigative material. By the time you carve those 3 categories out, who knows what's left of this thing?
I think we have to take a few more deep breaths, be patient, read what we can read now, and wait for the rest. And, you know, Barr does have to fairly go through some of the materials. I think the first half of the report's the harder one for him to go through. The second half of the report on obstruction probably doesn't require as much processing. We'll see what comes out.
What's your take about the whole process? By the way, welcome. Good to see you.
Great to be here. The process, it's kind of depressing for me. As sort of a political scientist who's been doing this for nearly 40 years now, since my undergraduate days, the process illuminates some of the real problems we have in our system that aren't going away, they're getting worse. And that is, rather than focusing on public policy, rather than getting elected so that you do things, you get elected to win. And that leads you to engage in all sorts of actions and behaviors and investigations and prosecutions that have nothing to do with the substance of public policy, and public policy withers. And as a result, our government isn't doing as much, but they're certainly on TV a lot more. And which basically means the whole point of being in Congress these days is to grandstand.
Well, the conversation about government doing as much, you know, if you're an alleged conservative back in the day, that was something that you'd be taking solace in, right? The idea that the government wasn't doing much. But I don't even know what a conservative is these days, because Donald Trump is kind of usurped that mantle with the politics of persona and moved people to the persona, borrowing a label that really doesn't apply anymore. right?
Yeah, the term conservative really has been evolving, just like the term liberal has. We are seeing a period where that old Burkean notion of restrained sort of moderation with the status quo being the main goal is kind of disappearing. And there aren't that many people who embrace that. And instead, there's a much more ideological version of social conservatism combined with free market economics, and it becomes absolutist. And on the other side, the same thing is happening, except with the role of government in regulating the economy and promoting certain social equality.
So going back to your original thought,
Sure.
you're disconcerted over the idea that this is about winning. It's on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, it's on both sides of the aisle. And, 30 years ago, there was this book that was put out that said, look, we no longer accept elections as the decision points in our system, and that's dangerous for democracy. Instead, what we do is we try to win elections even after we lose them by attacking the other side and using the tools of government. And, I've been concerned about this since the Clinton administration, at least. And we're seeing a similar process go on the other side, that, we don't like President Trump, and as a result, we're attacking him and finding ways to make it, to delegitimize him. Well, the guy was elected. You got to give him the time, 4 years, and so you really want him out. Make sure he doesn't get reelected. We've forgotten that, and I think this reinforces that.
So you think the investigation was what, illegitimate?
No, actually, the mechanisms of government created it, and so the executive branch created the investigation through the special counsel. And so there's certainly legitimate reasons to have executed this, particularly the obstruction charge, which happened after Comey was fired.
So I'm confused, though, about, your general disconcert about the entire atmosphere I get, and your definition of your mild depression over this, I understand. I'm trying to figure out how it applies to current event.
The way it applies to current events is everybody's going to take out of this what they want to take out of it politically rather than what it actually means. And we don't see the report, so we don't know what it really means. But once we see it, and I'm assuming we'll see it, much of it, if not all of it, the Democrats are going to take it and use it to promote whatever they were going to promote even before the report came out. The Republicans are going to take it and use it for exactly the same way that they were going to do it before the report came out. And nobody actually takes any kind of legitimacy to the process of Robert Mueller taking 2 years to do a careful investigation and accepting what he writes as the definitive and final investigation on this. So I'm willing to accept that President Trump did not commit an indictable offense, as President of the United States, even though he clearly did things that could lead to an indictment.
Well, yeah, I hear you, and so am I, by the way. My analysis about his political leadership, I think, colors people's thoughts about what the radio is more inflamed on this. The idea that Donald Trump won and guys like Dan York lost. I mean, please. I've never said that I was hoping that he would be indicted, and I've said all along I hope he doesn't get impeached because it's going to be something this country is really, really not well suited for right now. We're pretty afraid at this point. But I think one of the things that's interesting about the politics of this is that Donald Trump is such an enigma that how he fits into this 30-year cycle that you have seen is really interesting. He had every opportunity to if it was in his chemistry, to say at the time of his winning the election and when this thing started to heat up, look, I'm president. Like, hey, I'm president. That ain't going to change. You think I might have got here illegitimately. It doesn't matter. I won this thing, and this election should never have been affected by any foreign interference, so I'm going to do everything I can to learn that truth. He would have won the hearts and minds across the board here. Instead, he perpetuated the length of this Mueller investigation by his lack of cooperation and ongoing attacks.
If we had grown up in the White House, the first response, once the Mueller report came out and the Barr summary was released, was we need to make sure that those two things that the Russians did to essentially ensure his election, it's clear and unequivocal that the Russians intervened in two different ways, and they intervened to favor Donald Trump in the hopes of getting him elected. We're going to make sure that we have elections that are ours and not up for that kind of manipulation. He can't do it because he's not a grown-up. He's a man-child. And, personality-wise, he doesn't have the intellectual capacity or the emotional capacity to do that. And that's the type of problem that we have in the presidency.
Right, and so Democrats have got to recognize that going forward, seems to me. We'll come back and talk about what their next step is. Stay with us.
I think that we want to, right now, the message should be clearly, let us see this report. I have great respect for Special Counsel Mueller, but let us see the report. We don't need an interpretation by Attorney General who is appointed for a particular job to make sure the president is above the law. We need to see the report. So that's my message to our members.
Is impeachment off the table at this point?
Impeachment is not on the table until it is on the table, so it's not a question of that. This is not about that. This is about us doing our work. Today we're introducing our health care bill. Tomorrow we'll be doing climate. It's about building infrastructure in a green way. It's about clean government. We're on our agenda.
I think she has, I know this is a funny thing to say, but grown up in this office her second stint. I mean, we're finally starting to see some of the Pelosi that we've heard about.
I think so. Everything I know is that people have respect for her abilities and talents.
The grown up in the room, seems to me.
She does seem to be the grown up in the room, and she understands that she's kind of that triangulator that Bill Clinton was in the 90s, keeping her side a little closer to the center and trying to pull the other side towards her.
Well, listen, she's got some impeachment left types that just are living for that. To your point,
I think the single best thing that Democrats could do to reinsure a Trump re-election is to push the impeachment issue. I think they need to move on and start doing substantive stuff.
Well, it's hard for them to peel away right now, having not seen the report. And even Eric Holder was jumping into the fray yesterday, talking about Bill Barr's rationale for a 4-page letter ahead of. He has the requirement, based on the rules and the law regarding special counsel, to advise Congress, but not necessarily to take a stand on that which we haven't seen the diligence on.
Right. The content of what he wrote was up to him. The requirement that he does communicate in some way is in the law. And, nothing said he had to do it in 36 hours. And nothing had to say that, well,
he was working on it for a couple of weeks reportedly with the
But nobody had to say, nobody forced him to say, Mueller didn't take a side on whether Trump broke the law, but I will. My guess is that memo was written the way it was, the speed with which it was released, and with the content, all for an audience of one, and that's the president.
Well, that's disappointing, because I thought he was a little bit more grounded.
Well, Barr is part of the Republican Party that buys into the unitary executive theory, that once you're elected president, you essentially have all authority until you're out of office. And so
that is his philosophy.
He's obedient to the boss. And it doesn't matter who the boss is, the president is the boss. So my guess is he's following the wishes of the president, either explicitly or implicitly.
Well, not to jump ahead, I wanted to talk about Pelosi and the Democrats and what they do next. But since we're talking about Barr himself and in this chain, here's what's not in the report. We know that which is going on with the Southern District of New York. And I'm not really worried about Stormy Daniels. And now her attorney is all jammed up on another Nike. I mean, this movie is crazy. But that which maybe Cohen has been able to, and the CFO who has immunity has been able to talk to the Southern District about in terms of financial transactions and the like. I mean, that stuff seems to be still purring in the Southern District. And if the Southern District decides that they want to bring something, they're going to have to go right to Barr. He's their boss. And if Barr allows for such, it seems to me if the Southern District's got a case, he's not going to stop it.
Well, I agree. I think Barr has professional ethics, and as an attorney, he has to follow those rules. And I think if there is an indictable offense in the Trump family, it's going to come out of the Southern District, and Barr's not going to block it.
No. And all of a sudden, my prediction is by the end of the summer, Barr will be a bad guy again in the eyes of Donald Trump because he won't get in the way of what the Southern District of New York might have percolating. Now, who knows what they are ready to actually try or indict? But if they've got meat left on the bone on investigations that have borne from Mueller's discharge, not really my purview, but let me spread this thing out and give it to the Southern District. I think this story is not yet told, so I think the Democrats ought to keep their powder dry a little bit on this. If we're all looking for the truth, we should just relax, it seems to me, right?
That's what I've been saying for almost 2 years.
What are the Democrats going to do with this process, though? Seems to me that they wait for the report, they're issuing deadlines, we want the report by April 2nd. I'll give them a deadline. By Memorial Day, they better figure out whether they're in or out in terms of digging this thing up. I think out is better than in. Right, and creating a tumult that rolls right into the election season and gives, as you say, Donald Trump all the ammunition in the world to create a war here.
I do think the Democrats have to go back into content and talk about public policy. By the time we hit the summer, it's going to be presidential election season, and after all,
this summer.
Yeah, this summer.
How gross is that, by the way?
Yeah, again, this is one of the things that depresses me so much. The presidential election began the day after the inauguration this time around.
Yeah, but I don't think America is. It might be the early season, but I don't think America's paying attention to it.
No, because they're paying attention to the Twitter storm that comes out of the White House. And that he's been able to keep. Again, I don't want to go too much into his fundamental character, but this is a guy who really needs to be the center of attention, and so bad or good, attention is what he desires. And so we've been paying attention to whatever the president tells us to pay attention to, and that'll be a little harder once the campaign begins.
Republicans pursuing baggage around this investigation, including but not limited to the Clinton emails and the dossier. By the way, Lindsey Graham admits this week, yesterday, that he's the one who told John McCain, God rest his soul, to give the dossier to the FBI. Boy, that kind of takes the wheels off the complaints about John McCain from the president at all. Republicans looking for their pound of flesh in this as well?
Probably the best thing that Republicans can do for Democrats is to launch more investigations into all the stuff that they're accusing.
They'll be seen as equal bad players.
They'll be seen as equal bad players. But that's what I was talking about earlier when I talked about this tendency for us to focus on accusing the other of wrongdoing and then investigating as much as we possibly can, rather than putting your freaking nose down and do work. It's sort of students coming into class wanting to talk about current events and not doing the readings, because that's not as interesting. Do your work. Focus on public policy. Oversee the operations of government. Try to figure out what's going on.
In class, they're all hyper today oriented, and you're trying to teach some constitutional and political theory basics and everything else to get them to a more informed place, but they just want to talk about today? Is that what's happening?
It's frequently the problem. I tell my students, the best thing you could read is something that's really boring, because nobody else is reading that these days, and that's a transferable skill that everybody's going to want when you get out in the world. You can actually dive deep into 25 pages of something, and nobody's going to touch more than the first paragraph. That's your skill. And so I'm gonna push you away and get you thinking.
And speaking of that, I mean, nobody's going to touch more than the headline. I can't tell you how many callers on the radio yesterday I asked after they proffered what they thought was going on with this whole thing. Did you read the 4-page?
I did.
No, I'm at
Okay.
No, of course you did. You
Twice.
better have. No, you're on WPR. Trump vindicated. Did you read what Bill Barr had to say? No. Okay, but they read a headline. Exonerated, not maybe. Collusion, no. I mean, that's the depth with which most of America is dealing with this stuff.
I understand, and that's why I tell my students, get off of Twitter now.
Like you did.
Like I did.
To make you healthier, more mentally healthy?
To make me mentally healthy and allow me to read the boring stuff.
Well, we can't be too boring here or we lose the show. Our own local delegation on this next.
President Trump said Monday that he's leaving the decision to release special counsel Robert Mueller's report up to the Attorney General.
Up to the Attorney General. Wouldn't bother me at all.
The report was submitted by Mueller to Attorney General William Barr on Friday. It said while this report does not conclude the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse said Monday the report isn't the only thing that needs to be made public.
We not only need a release of the report, we need a release of some factual explanation of what took place with the Attorney General's declination on the obstruction side.
Attorney General Barr decided Mueller's investigation did not have sufficient evidence that the president committed obstruction of justice, a decision Democrats want to learn more about.
Certainly, a lot of what he did looked a lot to me like obstruction of justice.
I think we need to have Mr. Barr before the committee so he can explain the judgments he made within 48 hours to try to clear the president and shape the narrative here based on some quotations from the special counsel's report.
You know, it's interesting. The White House is completely familiar with Justice Department procedures, and Cicilline's a rising star as an articulator for the Democrats and a lawyer himself, and so he kind of gets it, notwithstanding their political positions or how you may like them. Both of them are prominent in this conversation, but they both make interesting points. What do you think is most relevant?
Well, I think most relevant is that it's clear from Cicilline's comments particularly, but also White House, is that they're going to go after Barr, and they're going to try to get him to explain it. I think the pressure is going to be on Barr to release as much of this report to the public as possible, which, by the way, I think is a reasonable thing to do once you protect the innocent. And, you know, the president isn't included in that list of innocents because he's a public figure. So my guess is these two are raising interesting points, and in the oversight capacity, they can bring Barr before them and ask him questions.
I just wonder how much of it just feels like white noise to America, though.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's going to be white noise to most people, and they're just going to read the headlines or the Twitter feeds, and they're going to pay attention to whatever the people who know how to do that tell them to, and that's not good.
And my guess is the base solidifies, and those who are on the fence, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen here. We stopped predicting a long time ago.
Yeah, I guess my best advice is tell people to just start thinking for yourself and read more deeply, and don't expect answers in 5 seconds.
And accept the idea that this guy is the President of the United States, and deal with it as you will, rather than hoping it's going to be over by some kind of intervention this way, because time's going to run out on that anyway.
I think that's right. I think elections mean something. They should mean something. They must mean something. And if you lose, you lose. Wait till next time.
That's a really interesting point. We need to develop that further, because I think you're absolutely right. We've forgotten how to lose.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Think about that. Final word, and we can. You know, Joe really makes a profound point. I think we got to say it slowly to ourselves. We have to learn how to lose, which should make you think about what you have to do to win, because elections do very much matter, and I think that's clear, no doubt about it. Alrighty, we'll talk to you on the radio from 3 to 6, as we do each weekday tomorrow. And what do we got coming in tomorrow? Huh? Oh, we're going to talk about ticket prices and whether you're getting screwed by buying online. Being careful about that. So be here tomorrow.